One of the reasons for the spread of English was the black population. During the early years of American settlement, English was also spreading in the South. The South comprises what may be referred to as the Third World and includes many countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The English that emerged from some of the African countries, particularly the West Indies, was very distinct from the native English. It was a result of the slave trade. Slave trade took place between Europe and Africa. What happened in the slave trade was that cheap goods were exchanged for black slaves, completing an Atlantic triangle of journeys between Europe, Africa, and West Indies. Slave trade was completed in 3 stages. In the first stage, ships left from British ports and also other ports in North Europe and reached West Africa. West Africa comprises countries like Gambia, Ghana, Nigeria, Liberia, etc. These ships carried finished goods like cloth, guns, ironwork, and drinks, especially the famous British drink rum. In the second stage, African slave dealers kidnapped villagers from hundreds of miles inland away from the coast. These kidnapped villagers were treated very cruelly. They were made to march to the coast hundreds of miles with their hands tied behind their backs and with wooden yokes around their necks. They were also threatened to be killed in case they disobeyed. These slaves were traded for the goods brought from Europe. In the third stage, the same slaves were transported to the Caribbean islands and American coasts. In these regions, these slaves were sold to the highest bidder, like animals. The slaves usually worked on sugar plantations for free. They were also treated in a very inhuman manner. It was made sure that the slaves who worked on the same plantations spoke different languages to avoid communication between them and subsequently to avoid revolts. These slaves were treated very harshly. Often they would resort to protest, sometimes in the form of revolution and sometimes silent protest. Many took their lives. The others would run away whenever they got an opportunity. Many women, pregnant women, would resort to abortion so that their children were not born into slavery. The money which was obtained in exchange for these slaves was used to buy goods, for example, sugar, etc., and was taken back to Europe. Thus, this triangular journey was completed, starting from Europe, mostly Northern Europe. The first stop was West Africa. From West Africa, the slave traders would go to West Indies and also America, and then from West Indies and America back to Europe with the goods that they had bought in exchange for the slaves. As a result of this slave trade, there emerged a new linguistic code. As I have just said that when these slaves were made to live together, or when they were transported on ships from West Africa to West Indies, it was made sure that the people who spoke the same language were not put together to avoid revolts. But of course, the people had to communicate with each other and also with their masters. So, unique kind of code of communication emerged out of this need for communication between the slaves and between the slaves and their masters. It was called pigeon. Pidgin can be described as a language or a communication code with simplified grammar. When the first generation of children was born to these slaves, they started using the same pidgin as their mother tongue. And it became more stable in terms of structure and lexicon. And then it was called a Creole. There were other Creoles also being used in the same area. These Creoles were Spanish-based or Dutch-based because they were used by the slaves who worked under Spanish or Dutch colonizers. The intermingling of different Creoles with standard English resulted in several varieties of English. So the English-based Creole and the other Creoles, when they became mixed with the standard variety of English, it gave rise to a number of varieties of English.